Lochs turns out, with shovels and tea flasks, then learns a camera can be sharper than a spade. There are few things more revealing in a Highland village than a road everyone uses and nobody quite wants to mend. A washed-out single-track stretch above Lochs has brought out volunteers, opinions, old grudges, and enough flasks of tea to float a ferry. Hamish Macbeth has been made community liaison, which means the council expects him to keep order while the village expects him to take the blame. Into this muddy little theatre comes Felix Harrow, a documentary photographer with a charming smile and a dangerous taste for other people's hardship. So settle in by the fire and mind your footing. On this road, the soft ground is not the only thing waiting to give way. Chapter 1. Shovels, soup, and sides taken. The road above Lochs had always been narrow, but there was ordinary Highland narrow, and then there was the kind of narrow that made a driver sit very straight and promise God better church attendance if no sheep appeared round the next bend. After 3 nights of rain, even that bargain seemed optimistic. The old single-track bog road climbed from the back of the village, bent round a shoulder of heather, and crossed a stretch of wet, uncertain ground before joining the higher track used by crofters, walkers, and the occasional tourist who trusted a map more than common sense. One edge had now slumped into the ditch. The gravel had gone soft underneath, and a brown bite of road had been eaten away by water. The council had responded with admirable speed. If one counted speed by geological standards, they had sent gravel, sandbags, warning tape, yellow-capped survey pegs, and a young man from Inverness who used the phrase community resilience 3 times before anyone had been offered tea. The villagers had responded with manpower, flasks, and blame. By 10 o'clock that morning, the place looked almost organised. Men in high-vis vests leaned on shovels with solemn importance. Women carried lists, biscuits, and corrections. 2 schoolboys, released from lessons for what the headmaster called civic engagement, had discovered that civic engagement meant lifting stones in a wind that cut through their jackets. Hamish Macbeth stood near the damaged edge, a yellow-capped survey peg in one hand and mud on both boots. His cap was pulled low, and his expression was mild enough to alarm anyone who knew him well. "Another foot to the left," said Moira Campbell. Moira had appointed herself coordinator, though she claimed the rota had simply fallen into her hands. She was tall, tidy, and so determinedly useful that even the weather seemed to feel under-supervised in her presence. A clipboard was pressed to her chest like a shield. Hamish looked at the ditch. "Another foot to the left and it'll be warning the frogs. It has to be visible." "Aye." "That's the usual ambition, with a warning peg." He drove it into the wet ground with the heel of his boot. The cap was bright yellow, bossy and cheerful against the mud. One side of it was cracked, leaving a tiny tooth-shaped piece missing from the rim. Hamish paused over it. "Council quality," he murmured. "What was that?" asked Moira. "Admiration." She gave him a look and moved on. Below them, Lochs lay grey and small beneath low cloud. Smoke from 2 chimneys rose briefly, then was flattened by the wind. The loch itself looked like a pewter plate that had been washed, but not dried. Near the tool shed, Lugs had made his contribution by lying full length across the doorway. The shed was a squat wooden thing with a swollen door and a smell of damp rope, old paint, and neglected ambition. Lugs had chosen the only place where everyone needed to pass. His chin rested on his paws. His eyes were half shut. He had the air of a dog suffering nobly through human foolishness. "Shift that animal," said Duncan Shaw, coming down the track with a wheelbarrow. Duncan was broad, weathered, and proud in the way of a man who owned tools and believed this settled most arguments. He ran a small contracting business from a yard behind his cottage and had already corrected 3 people on how to hold a shovel. "He'll move, if ye ask civilly," said Hamish. "I'm not asking a dog civilly." Lugs opened one eye. Duncan stopped. For a moment, man and dog considered one another across the long history of Highland stubbornness. "Come on, then," Duncan said at last. "Shift yourself, boy." Lugs sighed, rose with magnificent reluctance, and moved just enough to make the gesture insulting. That dog has the soul of a counsellor, said Archie McLean from beside the warning tape. All obstruction and no shame. A counsellor would have sent a form first, said Hamish. Archie laughed. He had come up from the harbour with rope, a flask, and the firm belief that because he understood water, he understood collapsed roads. So far his advice had been that the place was too wet. At the bend, Mrs. Wellington was trying to lift a sandbag while a slim man in an expensive weatherproof jacket photographed her. That's wonderful, said Felix Harrow. Don't look at me. Just be as you are. Mrs. Wellington straightened. As I am, she said, is wondering why a young man with clean gloves is taking pictures instead of lifting. Felix laughed, as if she had given him a gift. Exactly. That's perfect. It was not perfect. It was a complaint. He took another photograph. Felix Harrow had arrived in Lochs 2 days earlier with a hired van, a fine camera, and a project he called The Real Highlands. He had explained it in Patel's shop, outside the church, and once to Archie, who had been trapped by politeness beside the harbour wall. The project, Felix said, was about resilience, isolation, dignity, and the poetry of hard living. Lochs was not sure whether to be flattered or insulted, and had therefore chosen both. Mr. Patel had sold him batteries, oatcakes, and chocolate digestives without comment. Mrs. Patel later observed that any man who said authentic before paying was worth watching. Felix moved now among the volunteers, photographing muddy boots, red hands, steam from teacups, and the strain on faces when stones were lifted. He praised everything in a soft, intimate voice. Beautiful. That effort. That old communal bond. We're filling holes, said Archie. Yes. But that's the surface. It's the surface we're trying to fix. Felix smiled as if Archie had spoken profound truth instead of irritation. Hamish watched him with the patient unease he usually reserved for men who asked too many casual questions. At the gravel pile, Fiona Grant stood with a bucket of smaller stones. She had come late, quietly. Hood pulled up against the wind. Fiona lived in one of the damp cottages beyond the schoolhouse, cleaned when the Tommel Castle Hotel needed extra hands, and took in mending from women who preferred to call it alterations. She was not poor in the dramatic way outsiders liked. She was poor in the tiring way, where every bill had to be outstared before it was opened. Felix noticed her at once. He raised the camera. Fiona turned her face away. Please don't. He lowered the camera only a little. I'm sorry. I don't mean to intrude. That would be best done by not intruding. A couple of volunteers smiled into their cups, not kindly. Felix's face softened with professional sympathy. You have a very strong presence. There's a whole story in the way you're standing. Fiona's hands tightened on the bucket handle. Hamish stepped in before the silence could harden. There's a whole story in Duncan's wheelbarrow too, he said. Man against slope. Very tragic. You might capture it before he tips the gravel. Duncan, halfway up the rise, swore under his breath. Felix laughed and swung the camera away. Fiona gave Hamish the briefest look. It was not gratitude exactly. Gratitude would have exposed too much. But it was an acknowledgement, and then she went back to her stones. Moira appeared at Hamish's elbow. We need a clearer division of labour. There's a phrase to warm the heart. I mean it. Duncan's group should handle the gravel. Archie and the boys can set the larger stones along the verge. Mrs. Wellington is on tea. I am not on tea, called Mrs. Wellington. I am on moral supervision. Moira ignored her. That leaves Fiona for lighter work. Fiona heard. Her face closed. There were phrases that sounded kind, while making sure everyone noticed the kindness being performed. Lighter work was one of them. Hamish said, Fiona can help me with the pegs. Moira blinked. The safety markers? Aye. Unless Inverness sent a rule saying only men with opinions may touch them. Archie chuckled. Moira made a note. Perhaps about pegs. Perhaps about Hamish. Fiona came over without speaking. Together she and Hamish worked along the broken edge, placing the yellow-capped pegs where a driver might see danger before feeling it. The ground sucked at their boots. The wind pressed rain into their faces. "You've a steady hand," said Hamish. "I've mended enough things that were coming apart." There was no self-pity in it, which made the words heavier. Felix drifted closer again. The click of his camera was soft, but Fiona heard it. So did Hamish. "Mr. Harrow," said Hamish. "Felix, please." "Felix, then. Do ye always photograph folk who've asked you not to?" Felix lowered the camera with a wounded politeness that had probably worked well in cities. "I was photographing the line of the road, with Fiona in it. She gives scale. So would Duncan, and he'd be delighted to be useful. I'm useful without being photographed," said Duncan. Felix smiled, but there was a small edge beneath it now. "I understand the sensitivity, truly, but there's a danger in sanitizing rural life. People think beauty means comfort. I'm trying to show the truth." "Truth's a grand word," said Hamish, "often used by folk who don't have to live with the result." The wind moved between them. Moira clapped her hands. "Tea at 11:30. Soup at the hall from 6. Anyone on the evening shift, please don't pretend you forgot. I have the list." "I did forget," said Archie. "You signed your name with a fish beside it. That could be any man's fish." "It says Archie's fish." "Aye," said Archie. "Evidence is a terrible thing." Felix turned at that and took a photograph of Archie, laughing. Then his gaze shifted to the gravel bags, the delivery tags tied through their corners, and the clipboard under Moira's arm. "Who signs for the deliveries?" he asked. Moira looked up. "The council arranges them. That wasn't quite my question. Who records what arrives?" Duncan set down his wheelbarrow. "What's that to you?" "Nothing hostile," said Felix. "I like process. The infrastructure of community. What comes in, where it goes, who decides." Moira's smile tightened. "We all see what arrives." "Do you?" The question sat among them like a stone dropped into a bucket. Duncan wiped his hands on his trousers. "If you're doing a photo essay, take photos. Leave the road to folk who understand it." Felix lifted both hands. "Fair enough, but paperwork tells stories too." "Not interesting ones," said Duncan. "Oh," said Felix softly. "Often the most interesting." Hamish looked from Felix to Duncan, and then to the pile of gravel where the wet delivery tags slapped faintly in the wind. It was the first genuinely useful thing Felix Harrow had said all morning. Down by the shed, Lugs had reclaimed the doorway and was asleep again, sprawled like an old hearth rug. Mrs. Wellington was lecturing the schoolboys on the difference between service and showing off. Archie was tying knots no one had requested. Moira was making arrows on her clipboard. Fiona was setting stones with careful precision, as if each one might hold back more than water. Hamish planted the last peg near the bend. It was the cracked one, bright yellow against the mud, its missing tooth turned toward the ditch. He pressed it down firmly with his boot. For the moment, it held. Chapter 2. The picture everyone pretends not to see. By noon, Lochs had divided itself into those who had helped on the road, those who intended to help later, and those who had developed a sudden weakness in the back. The third group was the largest. Patel's shop was warm with bodies and wet coats. Rain tapped against the window in small, impatient bursts, and the bell over the door had not stopped ringing for 10 minutes. Volunteers came in for plasters, tobacco, chocolate, batteries, and the comfort of saying they had only popped in for a moment. Mrs. Patel stood behind the counter with the calm of a woman who had seen panic buying before weddings, funerals, storms, and raffle nights. "If the road is not open by Saturday," said Nessie Curry, "people will have to come round by the lower way." "That is what lower ways are for," said Mrs. Patel. "It adds 6 miles. Then it will give people more time to think." Jessie Curry, beside her sister, nodded gravely. "More time." Nessie gave Jessie a look. "I had already implied that." Jessie nodded again. Wounded, but loyal. The Curry sisters had come in for tea bags, though everyone knew they had come in for information. Nessie carried gossip like official correspondence. Jessie repeated it with amendments, often making it less accurate but more alarming. Archie McLean was near the biscuit shelf. explaining to anyone who would listen that the trouble with roads was water, and the trouble with water was that it went where it liked. "That is also the trouble with gossip," said Mr. Patel, who was restocking tins of soup. Nessie turned. "I hope you are not suggesting we gossip." "No," said Mr. Patel. "I am suggesting you travel naturally." Hamish Macbeth came in behind Fiona Grant, bringing a gust of cold air and the smell of wet wool. He had mud up one trouser leg and a streak of grit on his cuff. Fiona kept her hood up until she was fully inside, then pushed it back with care, as if hoping not to be seen too suddenly. Lugs, who had followed Hamish down from the road with the injured dignity of a dog underemployed, flopped beside the door and immediately blocked it. "Oh, not there," said Mrs. Patel. Lugs closed his eyes. "He's had a hard morning," said Hamish. "He has had a horizontal morning." "Aye, but in difficult weather." Mrs. Patel reached under the counter, produced a small broken biscuit, and held it up. Lugs opened one eye, reconsidered his political position, and moved 6 inches. It was enough for commerce to continue. Felix Harrow stood by the little display of postcards, fussing with a portable printer balanced on a crate of washing powder. His camera hung from his neck. He had drawn a small audience, which suited him very well. People who claimed they disliked attention often became strangely quiet in the presence of a machine that produced photographs of them. "It's only a rough proof," Felix was saying. "A teaser, really. I like to print while the atmosphere is still alive." "The atmosphere was mostly rain," said Archie. "Rain can be very eloquent. Mine just gets in my socks." The printer gave a small mechanical whir. A glossy photograph slid out. Felix lifted it by the edges and turned it toward the group. At first, nobody spoke. The picture showed Fiona's cottage. It had been taken from the road below, through rain. The washing line sagged across the foreground, shirts and towels pulled thin by the wind. Behind it, the cottage wall looked damp and tired, the paint blistered under the window. A bucket placed beneath a slipped gutter. There was a pale square of light inside, and in that light, barely visible through the glass, was the outline of a woman's hand lifting a curtain. It was a good photograph. That was what made it unkind. Felix smiled softly. "There's a poetry to endurance, don't you think?" Fiona went still. Someone near the back gave a small, embarrassed laugh and turned it into a cough. Nessie Curry leaned forward before remembering she ought not to appear interested. Jessie leaned forward because Nessie had. Hamish looked at the photograph, then at Felix. "When did you take that?" "Yesterday evening, just after the rain began again." "From the road?" "Yes. Public place." "Public's a legal word," said Hamish. "Not always a decent one." Felix's smile faltered, but only a little. "I didn't identify anyone. It's not about Fiona personally." "You know her name, then?" There was a small shifting in the shop. Fiona's face had gone pale in a way that made her look angry rather than weak. Felix turned toward her. "I'm sorry if this feels exposed. Truly. But people romanticize places like this. They need to understand what life is actually like." Fiona's voice was quiet. "Do they?" "Yes, I think so. And once they understand, will my roof stop leaking?" Nobody laughed then. Mrs. Patel reached for the photograph. "May I see?" Felix handed it over, eager again now that someone was treating it as art. Mrs. Patel studied it for a long moment. "You have made the washing look sad," she said. "That's part of the emotional truth. It was laundry." "Exactly. The ordinary becomes symbolic." Mrs. Patel put the picture down. "Sometimes the ordinary would prefer to dry in peace." Mr. Patel made a soft sound that might have been amusement. Nessie Curry said, too brightly, "Well, there is no shame in a little damp. We all have damp." Jessie nodded. "All of us?" Nessie's eyes narrowed. "Not all of us in the same way." Jessie looked confused. "No." Fiona reached for a loaf of bread from the shelf, though Hamish suspected she had forgotten what she had come in to buy. Felix, perhaps sensing he had lost the room but not yet understanding why, tried a different tone. "I do want to include the roadwork too." The communal effort. That's the balance. Hardship, yes, but dignity. Mrs. Wellington, who had entered unnoticed and was shaking rain from her umbrella with more force than necessary, said, "Young man, dignity is not something you give people with a camera." Felix turned, delighted to find another subject. "That's a marvellous line." It was not a line. It was a rebuke. He looked as if he might photograph her rebuking him, then thought better of it. Hamish moved to the counter and bought tea, matches, and a packet of dog biscuits he pretended were not for lugs. Fiona stood beside him, eyes lowered. "You needn't let him chase you out," Hamish said quietly. "I'm not being chased. No. I remembered I have things to do." "Ah, yeah. I always have things to do." Hamish nodded. "That's how they catch folk like you. They know you'll be too busy surviving to make a speech." She looked at him then, and there was a flicker of something sharp behind the tiredness. "I don't need speeches made for me either." "No," said Hamish. "Likely not." That seemed to please her more than sympathy would have. Behind them, Felix was speaking to Duncan Shaw, who had come in with his sleeves rolled down and his face washed clean of road mud. Duncan carried his usefulness into the shop like a title. "I noticed the delivery tags on the gravel bags," Felix said. "Do you keep them after use?" Duncan frowned. "Why would I?" "For records. Quantity, timing, supplier. It's interesting what a community receives and what actually gets used." Moira Campbell, who had just arrived with her clipboard under her coat, stiffened visibly. "The council keeps proper records," she said. "I'm sure. But local records are often more revealing." "There's nothing to reveal," said Duncan. Felix gave a small laugh. "That's what everyone says just before something becomes revealing." It was said lightly. But Duncan's jaw tightened. Hamish noticed Moira's fingers close on the edge of her clipboard. She had the expression of a woman who wanted the conversation tidied away and put in the correct drawer. Mr. Patel placed a bag of sugar on the counter. "Mr. Harrow, are you making a story about the road or an investigation of paperwork?" Felix smiled. "A story is never just one thing." "No," said Mr. Patel. "But sometimes a man does not know which story he is in." Felix looked at him, uncertain whether that was wisdom or warning. The bell over the door rang again, and Jamie Ross came in with his hood up and his hands red from cold. He was 17, thin, angry with the world in the way of boys who had not yet found where to put their pride. His mother worked nights at the care home in Strathbane. His father was mentioned rarely, and never with warmth. Jamie had been on the road crew that morning because the school had sent him, but he had worked harder than the boys who complained louder. He saw the photograph before he saw Fiona. "What's that?" he said. Felix turned. "A proof." Jamie crossed the shop and snatched it from the crate. Fiona said, "Jamie, leave it." But he was already looking. His face changed. It was not a dramatic change. It was worse than that. His mouth tightened, and the flush that came up his neck was not just anger, but shame on somebody else's behalf. "You took this of her house?" Felix reached for the picture. "Careful with it." Jamie pulled it back. "You stood outside and took this?" "It's part of a series. What do you call it? Poor folk in the rain?" "Jamie," said Hamish. The boy ignored him. "You think this is funny?" "No," said Felix, losing patience at last. "I think it matters." "To who?" "To people who don't see this kind of life." Jamie laughed once, harshly. "Lucky them." Fiona stepped between them, or tried to. "Give it back." Jamie looked at her. The anger went out of him so quickly it left embarrassment behind. He handed the photograph to her, not Felix. "I'm sorry," he muttered. Felix held out a hand. "That is my print." Fiona looked at the photograph, then at the gathered faces. Nessie had the grace to look down. Jessie copied her, late. Moira studied her clipboard. Duncan stared at the biscuit shelf as if biscuits had become urgent. Mrs. Patel stood very still. Fiona laid the photograph on the counter. "There," she said. "Now everyone has seen it." Felix opened his mouth, but for once nothing charming came out. Jamie turned on him. You come up to the road again, pointing that thing at folk who don't want it, and I'll put it in the ditch. Jamie, Hamish said again. Quieter this time. The boy heard the difference. He stepped back, breathing hard. Felix recovered his composure with visible effort. Threats don't help your case. I haven't got a case. No, said Felix. But you might become part of one. That was an ugly little sentence, and it landed. Hamish saw it land on Jamie, on Fiona, on Moira, even on Duncan. A camera, a notebook, a printer on a washing powder crate, small things, harmless things, until someone realised they could fix a person in the eyes of strangers and leave them there. Mrs. Patel folded the photograph once, neatly, then again. Felix stared. What are you doing? Helping it become smaller. You can't. You printed it in my shop, she said. Consider it a local edit. For a moment, Hamish thought Felix might make a scene, but Felix looked around and seemed to calculate the room. He gathered his printer, his paper, and his pride. I'll be at the hall tonight, he said. I'd like to speak to some of you properly. I'd like a castle, said Archie. We all live with disappointment. Felix left. The bell rang behind him. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Rain ran down the window in crooked lines. Lugs, sensing that tension had replaced biscuits as the dominant shop activity, sighed from the doorway. Then Nessie Curry said, Of course, Fiona. No one thinks any less of you. It was perhaps the worst possible kindness. Fiona smiled politely, which was more painful to watch than tears would have been. I'll pay for the bread, she said. Mrs. Patel pushed the loaf toward her. You will pay tomorrow. I can pay today. I know, said Mrs. Patel. Tomorrow I will need change. Fiona hesitated, then took the bread. Hamish looked out through the wet glass. Across the street, Felix stood under the awning by the post-box, writing in a small black notebook. He was not leaving Lochdu. Not yet. Duncan Shaw came to the window and looked too. Man like that, he said, sees dirt and calls it depth. Aye, said Hamish. And folk let him. Some folk. Duncan glanced at him. Meaning? Nothing yet. Outside, Felix closed the notebook and turned his face toward the road above the village, where the yellow-capped pegs marked the broken edge against the mist. Hamish watched him for another moment. The road had begun as a problem of weather and gravel. It was becoming a problem of pride. And pride, in Hamish's experience, caused worse accidents than rain. Chapter 3. Soup Night Politics. By 6 o'clock, the village hall smelled of wet coats, boiled vegetables, and the particular kind of civic virtue that comes from people eating free soup while judging the folk who had brought the wrong bread. Moira Campbell had arranged the tables in 3 rows, which lasted exactly 4 minutes before Archie McLean moved one for circulation and Mrs. Wellington moved it back for discipline. The great soup pot sat at the far end on a trestle table, steaming under the supervision of Mrs. Patel, who had brought extra lentils because Highland weather, in her opinion, could not be trusted to feed anyone. Hamish stood near the door, trying to look too unimportant to be asked anything. It did not work. Hamish, said Moira, appearing beside him with her clipboard. We need to discuss tomorrow's rota. We discussed it this morning. That was before Archie claimed his wrist was strained. It is strained, said Archie, from a chair near the stove. I over-knotted. You tied 3 unnecessary knots, said Moira. Aye, but I tied them strongly. Lugs lay under Hamish's table, sprawled like an old hearthrug, occupying enough space to make everyone step round him with careful little dances. Every few minutes someone dropped a crumb, accidentally or not, and Lugs accepted it with the weary dignity of an animal carrying a village through moral decline. Fiona Grant had come to the hall with a basket of scones wrapped in a clean cloth. She placed them quietly near the soup and began helping Mrs. Patel with bowls before anyone could decide whether to pity her. Jamie Ross sat against the wall, hood down now, face set in that young, hard way which usually meant either anger or embarrassment. In his case, Hamish suspected both. The Curry sisters sat together in the second row, observing everyone with the strained innocence of women who would later claim they had noticed nothing. That boy has a temper, Nessie whispered. A temper, Jessie agreed. And that photographer has a manner. A manner, Nessie paused. You needn't repeat every noun. Jessie looked wounded. I was supporting the thought. At 6:30, the door opened, and Felix Harrow came in, with his camera bag over one shoulder and rain shining on his hair. He had changed into a dark wool jacket that looked rugged in the way expensive clothing often did before meeting actual hardship. Conversations faltered, then resumed a little too loudly. Felix smiled, as if he had been warmly received. Please don't stop on my account. No danger of that, said Mrs. Wellington. Felix took a bowl of soup from Mrs. Patel. Thank you. It smells wonderful. It is soup, said Mrs. Patel. It is not applying for praise. He laughed, though uncertainly, and moved along the table. Hamish watched the room rearrange itself around him. Nobody moved far. Nobody openly shunned him. But shoulders angled, glances passed, and several people became very interested in their spoons. Felix seemed to notice all of it and, worse, to enjoy it. Moira stepped forward, clapping her hands. Right. Before we eat properly, a brief announcement. Tomorrow we need 2 teams. One at the upper bend, one by the lower ditch. We must keep the road passable for emergency access, deliveries, and Mr. MacLeod's sheep trailer. His sheep trailer should be declared an emergency in itself, muttered Archie. Moira continued. The council has promised another gravel drop in the morning. Promised, said Duncan Shaw from the back. There's a word with no boots on it. A few people laughed. Duncan accepted the laugh without smiling. He stood with his arms folded, a man shaped by usefulness and used to being seen that way. His boots were clean now, Hamish noticed, because they had been caked with wet grit that afternoon. Duncan noticed Hamish noticing, and looked away. Felix looked up from his soup. Another delivery? That's excellent. Are the tags logged here or by the council? The room cooled. Moira's smile fixed itself in place. Mr. Harrow, we are trying to organise volunteers, not hold an inquiry. Of course. I'm just interested. Aye, said Hamish mildly. We had gathered that. Felix turned to him with a good-humoured tilt of the head. You sound suspicious, Constable. Only of interest. It's a restless thing. Before Felix could answer, the hall door banged open. Detective Chief Inspector Blair came in with the weather, a cigarette smell, and the expression of a man who had discovered happiness in finding fault. He was damp across the shoulders, red in the face, and breathing as if the hill had insulted him personally. What's this? He demanded. A soup kitchen or a road crew? Mrs. Wellington said. It can be 2 things, though perhaps not to some minds. Blair ignored her because he preferred enemies in uniform. Macbeth, so it's true. They've made you foreman and nanny. Hamish's face remained mild. Good evening to you too, sir. Blair looked around at the bowls, the stacked coats, the handwritten rota pinned to the notice board. Waste of time. Half these folk wouldn't know work if it bit them on the backside. Several volunteers straightened with the offended dignity of people who had done just enough work to resent being accused of doing none. Moira flushed. People have been giving their time. Aye, and making sure everyone sees them give it, I'll bet. That hit too close to the truth for comfort. A murmur passed through the hall. Felix, brightening, reached casually toward his camera bag. Hamish saw it. So, said Hamish, stepping slightly into Blair's line of sight, you came all this way for soup, sir? I came because headquarters wants to know why a damaged road has turned into a village pageant. The pageant's at Christmas, and because some fool in the council says you're community liaison. Aye. I was hoping it was a rumour. Blair snorted and reached for a bowl. Mrs. Patel served him without enthusiasm. No smoking inside, she said. I'm not smoking. You smell like the memory of it. That drew one careful laugh, quickly buried. Blair took the bowl and turned. His eyes landed on Fiona, who was ladling soup for Jamie. And who's this? The face from the poorhouse picture? The room went still. Fiona froze with the ladle in her hand. Jamie pushed his chair back. Felix's hand closed around his camera strap, and his eyes sharpened with shameful interest. Hamish spoke before Jamie could. "Sir." "It was one word," softly said. Blair turned. "What?" Hamish's voice kept its Highland mildness, but something thin and cold had entered it. "You'll no be speaking that way to Mrs. Grant." Blair's mouth twisted. "Don't get above yourself, Macbeth. I'm standing where I usually stand. I, in the road." Hamish did not smile. "Better than pushing folk into the ditch." For a moment, Blair looked as if he might explode. But he had a good instinct for rooms, when not for people. He saw the faces turn toward him. "Mrs. Patel's controlled disapproval, missus." Wellington's open contempt, Moira's alarm, Duncan's watchfulness, Jamie's clenched fists. Blair barked a laugh. "Sensitive lot, aren't you? No wonder nothing gets done." He carried his soup to the far side of the hall. The room began breathing again. Fiona set down the ladle with care. Hamish went to her, but stopped at a distance that allowed her not to be rescued in public. "All right?" he asked quietly. "No," she said. It was such an honest answer that he had none ready. Then she added, "But I'm still here." "Aye," said Hamish. "That you are." Felix, who had been watching them, looked almost moved. That made Hamish dislike him more. When people settled again, the hall became noisier than before, as if volume could wipe away what had been said. Bowls clinked, chairs scraped. Archie told the schoolboys about a storm in 1978, which grew worse each time he told it. Jessie Curry asked whether gravel could be stolen, and Nessie told her not to be foolish in a tone that suggested she would be discussing exactly that later. At the notice board, Moira pinned up tomorrow's rota with unnecessary force. Felix approached her. "I'm sorry if my questions make people uncomfortable." Moira did not turn. "Then stop asking them." "I can't. It's part of the work." "So is discretion, surely." He smiled. "Discretion is often what powerful people ask for when they mean silence." Moira turned then, sharply. "No one here is powerful." Felix glanced around the hall. "Power is relative." His eyes rested on Duncan Shaw, who was speaking to Blair near the stove. Duncan's face was closed, but his hands moved as he talked, practical and controlled. Blair listened with the lazy impatience of a man waiting to interrupt. Hamish, watching from the tea urn, saw Felix raise his camera, not fully, just enough to take a shot without making a show of it. Duncan saw too. His expression hardened. A few minutes later, Felix drifted toward Hamish. "I'm going back up after supper," he said. "To the road?" "Yes. The light at dusk is extraordinary. Fog. Pegs. That broken edge. The real edge, if you like." "I don't," said Hamish. Felix laughed. "You're very protective of people's edges, Constable." "I'm fond of folk keeping their footing." "I'll be careful." Careful men don't usually need to say it. Felix looked toward the hall windows. Outside, evening was already drawing itself across the village. Rain had eased to a fine mist. The hills above Lochs were fading into grey. "I want the road without people," Felix said. "Just the markers, the ditch, the place where community meets danger." Hamish regarded him. "You rehearse these phrases?" "Sometimes. It shows." Felix smiled, accepting that almost as praise. Behind them, Jamie stood abruptly and walked out through the side door. Fiona watched him go. A moment later, she followed, taking her coat from the peg. Hamish waited just long enough not to make a spectacle of it, then slipped outside. The air had turned colder. The yard behind the hall was slick with rain, and the bins shone under the weak yellow light. Jamie stood by the wall, kicking at loose gravel with the toe of his boot. Fiona was beside him, speaking low. "You mustn't rise to it," she said. Jamie looked away. "Everybody does what they like, and then tells me not to rise to it." "I know." "No, you don't. I know more than you think." His shoulders dropped a little. Hamish stayed near the doorway. He had no wish to overhear what was not his, but Jamie saw him. "I'm not going to hit him," the boy said. "I never said ye were. You thought it." "I think many things." Most of them useless. Jamie tried not to smile and failed for half a second. Fiona wrapped her coat tighter. He makes people feel small. Aye, said Hamish. The photographer or Blair? Asked Jamie. Hamish looked back toward the hall, where shadows moved behind the steamed windows. It's a busy evening. There's enough making small to go round. From the road above the village came the distant sound of a van, engine starting. Felix was leaving early then, or not leaving. Hamish stepped out into the lane and looked up toward the hill. Through the thinning mist, he saw the faint sweep of headlights turning onto the single-track road. A moment later, they vanished behind the rise. Inside the hall, someone laughed too loudly. The soup night went on, as soup nights do, covering embarrassment with second helpings. Hamish watched the darkness gather above Lochs. Felix Harrow had said he wanted to walk the line at dusk, and the line, Hamish thought, was already a dangerous place. Chapter 4. The Ditch. The mist thickened after supper. It did not roll dramatically over the hills. Lochs mist rarely did anything for the benefit of poets. It crept, spread, and settled, making the world smaller by degrees until familiar walls became shadows and the road above the village seemed to belong to another place entirely. Hamish Macbeth left the village hall later than he intended, which was often the price of trying not to be useful. Moira Campbell had cornered him by the notice board with questions about tomorrow's rota, the council's promised gravel delivery, and whether the volunteers should sign an attendance sheet. Attendance sheet? Hamish had said. For accountability. Moira, half the village came today because they thought somebody else might not. That is not a system. No, but it's a tradition. She had not been amused. Outside, the hall windows glowed yellow behind him. Inside, the soup night still clattered on in smaller groups. People who had announced they were leaving had found 3 more things to say. Mrs. Wellington was explaining to Archie that a road was a public duty. Archie was explaining to Mrs. Wellington that a public duty should not begin before breakfast. The Curry sisters stood near the coat hooks, gathering observations like women harvesting berries. Lugs was waiting on the step, having abandoned the hall when it became clear no more scones were falling. "You've had your share," said Hamish. Lugs gave him a look of deep injury. "Aye, and Archie's share." The dog rose slowly, stretched, and trotted ahead into the lane with the confidence of an animal who believed darkness had been arranged for his convenience. Hamish turned his collar up. The air smelled of wet grass, peat smoke, and the faint oily tang of Blair's cigarettes, though Blair himself had gone. He had departed loudly, telling anyone who would listen that if Strathbane were running the road repair, there would be cones, signs, and proper authority. There would also be 3 men watching 1 man dig, Mrs. Patel had said. Blair had not heard her, which was probably best for everyone. Hamish crossed the lane toward the police station, but paused when he heard footsteps behind him. Fiona Grant came out of the hall, carrying her empty scone basket. She had a scarf drawn round her throat, and her hood up again. In the spill of light from the doorway, her face looked tired, but composed. "You'll be all right getting home?" Hamish asked. "It's only along the village." "Aye. But folk have been saying things." "Folk always say things. That doesna make them lighter." She shifted the basket from one arm to the other. "Jamie shouldn't have spoken like that in the shop." "No, but he meant well. A dangerous habit in a boy." A faint smile touched her mouth. "He was angry for me because I did not look angry enough." Hamish nodded. Fiona looked up toward the hill, though the mist hid most of it. "That photographer went back, didn't he?" So he said. "In this, he has a feeling for atmosphere. He has a feeling for himself." There was no bitterness in her voice, only weariness. That made Hamish listen more closely. "Did he speak to you again?" he asked. "Not after the shop." "Good." She glanced at him. "You can't stand between him and everyone." "No. I'd get tired, and he'd find another angle." That earned a real smile, quick and gone. The hall door opened again, releasing voices and warmth. Jamie Ross came out, saw Fiona, and stopped, as if deciding whether to join her or pretend he had not been looking for her. Fiona saw the hesitation. "Come on," she said. You can carry the basket if you need something to do with your hands. Jamie took it without protest. Hamish watched them go down the lane together, the woman quiet and straight-backed, the boy awkward with his care. They passed Patel's shop, where the window light shone on tins and packets and the small, ordinary abundance of village life. Lugs nudged Hamish's leg. "Aye," said Hamish. "We're going." But he did not go inside. Instead he stood for a moment, listening. The village had settled into its night noises. A door closing, a late kettle, the distant cough of a vehicle, rainwater running from gutters. Above it all, from the hill road, came a sound that did not belong. A faint shout. Hamish lifted his head. The mist muffled distance, and for a moment he thought he might have imagined it. Then came another sound. Not a word this time. More like a cry cut short. Lugs gave one sharp bark. Hamish was already moving. The road up from the village was slick underfoot. He took the path behind the schoolhouse, the quickest way to reach the lower bend, with Lugs padding ahead and then stopping to look back impatiently. The mist thickened as they climbed, turning the beam of Hamish's torch into a pale tunnel. Heather brushed wet against his legs. Halfway up, he saw a figure stumbling down toward him. It was Moira Campbell. Her clipboard was clutched to her chest, though God knew why she had brought it into the fog. Her face was white, and her breath came in hard little pulls. "Hamish, what is it?" I saw." Slowly, she swallowed. "A light, up by the damaged edge. I thought it was Mr. Harrow. I went to tell him it was dangerous. Then I heard something fall." "Where?" "Near the bend. By the pegs. Did you see anyone else?" "I don't know." "I saw movement. Or mist. I don't know." Hamish put a hand on her shoulder, firm enough to steady her. "Go back to the hall. Tell Mr. Patel to phone for an ambulance, and Strathbane. Say there's been an accident on the road." "Accident?" "Go, Moira." She went, nearly slipping on the wet grass before catching herself. Hamish continued up. The single-track road appeared in pieces. A strip of black wet surface, a white stone at the verge, the trembling yellow of a survey peg in torchlight. The warning tape snapped softly in the wind. Beyond it, the ditch dropped away into dark, waterlogged ground. "Felix!" Hamish called. No answer. Lugs moved ahead, then stopped near the broken edge. He did not bark this time. He stood, with his head low, body tense in a way that made him look less like a lazy hearthrug and more like an animal from an older, harder world. Hamish followed the dog's gaze. At first he saw only a shape in the ditch. Then his torch found the camera strap. Felix Harrow lay half on his side below the road, one arm twisted beneath him, his face turned toward the wet grass. His camera was near his hand. The lens cracked. Mud streaked his coat. The scarf, that had looked so careless and elegant in daylight, was dark with water. Hamish went down carefully, testing the ground before each step. The slope was treacherous. One wrong foot would send him sliding. The ditch smelled of wet earth and crushed grass. He crouched beside Felix and touched 2 fingers to his neck. Nothing. The silence that followed was not empty. It held the faint drip of water, Lugs's breathing above him, and the far-off murmur of voices from the village beginning to change shape as news travelled. Hamish stayed still for a moment. He had disliked Felix Harrow. He had disliked his manner, his vanity, his appetite for other people's bruises. But dislike was a living thing. It could be answered, corrected, outweighted. This was different. Death took even an irritating man out of argument and left only the fact of him. Hamish rose carefully and swept the torch over the ground. The obvious story lay ready for anyone who wanted it. Dusk. Mist. A broken verge. A man too eager for atmosphere stepping close to the edge and going down. But obvious stories were often lazy. They liked to arrive before the facts. Near Felix's right hand, something yellow caught the light. Hamish bent. A sliver of plastic lay pressed into the wet grit. It was small, curved, and bright against the dark mud. He picked it up with the edge of his handkerchief and turned it in the torchlight. It looked like a tiny broken tooth. He looked up toward the road. The nearest yellow-capped peg stood at an angle, not where he remembered planting it. Its cap was cracked wider now, the broken rim facing the ditch. Hamish climbed back up slowly and crouched beside it. The ground around the peg was churned. Not wildly, but enough. More than one set of feet had been there, though the mist and wet had softened the marks. He shone the torch along the road. A few yards away, in the wet grit near the verge, were boot prints. One set broad and deep, another narrower, turned outward as if someone had twisted away. There were wheelbarrow tracks too, old or new he could not yet tell, their twin lines blurred by rain. Lugs sniffed near the peg, then sneezed. "Aye," said Hamish softly. "It's no tidy, is it?" From below came a faint electronic beep. Hamish went back down to Felix. The camera, though cracked, still showed a dim light at the side. He did not touch the buttons. Instead, he looked at Felix's coat pockets. One bulged slightly, and from it protruded the corner of a notebook, damp at the edges. A photographer with a notebook. Questions about gravel tags. Questions about who signed and who saw. Questions that had made Duncan stiffen and Moira tighten her grip. Hamish stood again. The mist shifted, and for a moment the village lights appeared below, blurred and warm. Lochs looked peaceful from up here, as if soup were still being poured and people were still deciding whether they had been generous enough for one day. Then voices came up the road. Archie arrived first, breathless, followed by Mr. Patel carrying a lantern, Jamie, Ross, and Moira, who had evidently failed to obey the instruction to go back and stay back. Behind them came others, gathering as people do when fear and curiosity are too close to separate. "Stay where ye are," Hamish called. They stopped. "What is it?" asked Archie, though his voice showed he knew. Hamish climbed to the road and stood between them and the ditch. "Felix Harrow's down there." Moira put a hand to her mouth. Jamie stared past Hamish into the mist. His face had lost all its colour. "Is he?" "Aye," said Hamish. There was a small sound from someone at the back. Jessie Curry, perhaps, or Nessie. In shock, even gossip forgot which sister was which. Duncan Shaw appeared last, walking quickly but not running. His gaze went to the ditch, then to Hamish, then to the yellow peg leaning at the edge. "What happened?" he asked. Hamish watched him. "That's what we'll be finding out." Duncan looked down at his boots. They were muddy again. Blair arrived 20 minutes later, in a police car that came too fast up the narrow road and stopped too close to the warning tape. He got out swearing at the fog, the council, the road, and Highlanders in general. "Where is he?" he demanded. Hamish pointed. Blair looked into the ditch, then back at the gathered villagers. "Idiot photographer," he said. "Told you this would happen. Folk wandering about in mist for pretty pictures." No one answered. Hamish held out his folded handkerchief. "I found this near his hand." Blair peered at the yellow sliver. "What is it?" "Part of a survey peg cap, I think." Blair glanced at the leaning peg. "So he fell and broke it." "Maybe." Blair's eyes narrowed. "Don't start, Macbeth." "I've not started." "Aye, you have. I know that voice." Hamish looked toward the ditch, where Felix Harrow lay, beyond the easy comfort of dislike. "Then you'll know I'm just warming up." The wind tugged at the warning tape. It fluttered between them, yellow and restless in the mist. Chapter 5. Canteen Grease, Kitchen Kindness. By morning, Strathbane had taken charge, which meant Blair had shouted at the fog, the road, the council, and Hamish Macbeth, in that order. The mist had lifted from the single-track road, leaving the damaged edge raw under a flat grey sky. The yellow survey peg stood along the verge, bright and foolish-looking now. The cracked one near the bend had been bagged as evidence, though Blair had done so with the expression of a man humouring a child. Felix Harrow's body had been taken away before breakfast. That did not remove him from Lochs. It only made him larger. He was in every silence, every glance toward the hill, every unfinished sentence that began, "Mind you, He should never have gone up there. At Strathbane Police Station, the canteen served Hamish something brown between 2 slices of bread. He lifted the top slice. "What is it?" he asked. "Breakfast," said Blair. "That's generous." Blair bit into his own sandwich as if punishing it. "Preliminary report says broken neck consistent with a fall." Consistent is a careful word. It means he fell. It means he might have. Blair glared at him. "Don't start, Macbeth." He went up in mist, poked his nose where it didn't belong, and went into a ditch, with a broken bit of yellow peg cap near his hand. Because he fell beside a yellow peg. Maybe. There's that word again. Detective Sergeant MacNab turned a page in his notes. Camera cards intact. Techs are checking timestamps. Notebook was damp but readable. Hamish looked up. "Anything about gravel deliveries?" MacNab hesitated. Blair slammed down his mug. "You'll get what I give you when I give it. And I am not having you turn a road repair into some grand conspiracy." "Not grand," said Hamish. "Likely small. Those are often nastier." Blair snorted. "You've got a village full of guilty faces and you want it clever. Sometimes a fool just falls." "Aye," said Hamish. "And sometimes he's helped." By the time Hamish returned to Lochs, the village hall had reopened, though the road repair had officially paused. Mrs. Patel was in the kitchen making lentil soup with the calm authority of a woman who believed bad news should never be faced on an empty stomach. Lugs lay near the stove, sprawled like an old hearth rug, waiting for carrots to fall. "He is not guarding anything," said Mrs. Patel. "He is supervising gravity." "It's important work," said Hamish. She handed him tea. "You look as if someone has fed you badly. Officially. That is always worse." In the hall, people sat in loose groups, pretending they had gathered to discuss the road. In truth, they were there because death had come close, and no one wanted to be alone with what they had thought about Felix Harrow while he was still alive. Moira Campbell stood by the notice board, straightening a rota nobody could use. Hamish went to her first. "You went up after him last night," he said. She pressed her lips together. "I heard he meant to photograph the road at dusk. I thought if he got hurt, everyone would say we should have stopped him." "And did you see him?" "A light near the pegs. A torch, perhaps." "Then I heard voices." "Words?" "No." One voice sounded like Mr. Harrow, irritated. "And the other?" "I don't know." Hamish waited. Moira looked away. "I saw movement near the tool shed after. It might have been a person. It might have been mist." "Mist doesna usually hurry." "No," she said quietly. Across the hall, Duncan Shaw was explaining to 2 men that the verge had been unsafe for years. He spoke with the grave confidence of a contractor who had been ignored and now had tragedy as evidence. Hamish joined him. "Your boots were clean in the hall last night," he said. Duncan frowned. "Is that police work now? They were muddy when you came up after Felix was found." "I'd gone to check the tarps on the gravel bags." "In the fog?" "Rain was coming." "Wet gravel is wasted gravel." A public-spirited thought. Duncan's jaw tightened. "That photographer was asking poisonous questions." "About delivery tags?" "About things that were none of his business." "Were they none of his business because he was rude? Or because he was right?" Duncan stepped closer. "Careful, Hamish. I tree." Duncan looked toward the kitchen, where Jamie Ross was drying mugs with more force than necessary. "You should be asking him." He threatened Harrow in front of witnesses. "A public threat is a foolish thing," said Hamish. "Not always a murderous one. Angry boys do angry things. So do proud men." Duncan's face closed. Outside the hall, Hamish found Jamie by the wall, pretending not to smoke. The boy dropped the cigarette when he saw him. "It wasn't mine. A charitable cigarette." Jamie flushed and crushed it under his boot. "Where were you after supper?" asked Hamish. "Home. Anyone see you?" "My mum was on nights, so no." "Did you go up the road?" "No." "You threatened Felix." "I wanted to break his camera." "That's different." "Aye. Still not wise. He made Fiona look small," Jamie said. like folk could stare at her life and feel deep for 10 seconds, then go back to their warm houses. Hamish studied him. That's well put. Jamie looked embarrassed by his own feeling. Did you see anyone leave the hall after Felix? Jamie hesitated. There's a difference between telling truth and feeding yourself to Blair, said Hamish. The boy swallowed. Moira went out, then Duncan. Through the back. Said something about tarps. Anyone else notice? Maybe Fiona. Fiona came out then with a tray of empty bowls. She stopped when she saw them. Mrs. Patel wants these washed, she said. Jamie took the tray too quickly. I'll do it. You'll drop them. I won't. You dropped a bucket of stones yesterday. That was Duncan's fault. He barked at me. The small argument softened the air between them. Jamie went inside. Hamish turned to Fiona. Did you see Duncan leave? Yes. And come back? I don't know. That's not like you. You notice things. I try not to. It's cheaper. She looked toward the hill. I saw him later, coming down by the side track near his yard. He looked angry. He said the photographer had brought trouble on himself. Inside, Blair's voice suddenly boomed. Where's the Ross boy? Hamish stepped back into the hall. Jamie stood near the kitchen hatch, hands wet from washing bowls. Blair moved toward him, red-faced, and pleased with the direction of his own thoughts. You made threats yesterday, Blair said. In front of half the village. Jamie lifted his chin. I was angry. That's handy. I like my suspects simple. The hall went still. Hamish crossed the room. Sir, stay out of it, Macbeth. I will, when you start doing it properly. Blair turned. What did you say? Hamish's voice stayed soft, but something cold entered it. The boy's not to be bullied because he's convenient. Jamie's face burned red. Blair jabbed a finger toward him. He threatened a dead man. In public, said Hamish. Which makes him daft. Not clever. You got proof he was home? No. Have you proof he went up the road? Blair's mouth tightened. Mrs. Patel appeared in the kitchen doorway, with a ladle in her hand. Inspector, she said, if you are accusing people in my soup queue, you may wait until they have eaten. No one laughed. That made it stronger. Blair glared round the hall, found no support worth having, and pointed at Jamie. I'll be speaking to you. I'm here, said Jamie, though his voice shook. For now, said Blair. He stormed out, taking the room's air with him. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Mrs. Patel said, Soup is getting cold. Bowls were lifted. Chairs scraped. Conversations returned in lower voices. Hamish watched the village begin to settle around a simpler story. Jamie had shouted. Jamie had a temper. Jamie was young, poor, and easy to imagine guilty. Near the notice board, Moira avoided Fiona's eyes. Duncan stood with his arms folded, looking solemn and useful. Jamie stared at the floor. Fiona wiped a table that was already clean. Hamish looked through the window toward the hill road. Somewhere up there were boot marks, wet grit, broken yellow plastic, and photographs of delivery tags. But down here, Lochs had already found something easier than truth. It had found someone to blame. Chapter 6. Hamish's Mistake. By the next evening, Lochs had become careful. Not kinder. Not wiser. Just careful. People lowered their voices when Jamie Ross came into Patel's shop. They stopped talking too quickly when Fiona Grant passed the schoolhouse. At the village hall, hands that had cheerfully lifted bowls of soup the night before now found reasons to be busy when Fiona approached with a tray. There are few cruelties more efficient than public sympathy withdrawn in private. Hamish noticed it while standing by the hall kettle, trying to make tea from water that had boiled 3 times and tasted of old metal. Moira Campbell was at the notice board again, though there was still no official roadwork. Duncan Shaw was outside with 2 men, discussing verge stability in a voice large enough to carry through glass. Blair had gone back to Strathbane, leaving behind suspicion like cigarette smoke. Luggs lay under a chair, asleep with one paw over his nose. He had spent the afternoon following Hamish from room to room in the hope that the investigation might involve sausages. It had not. Fiona came in quietly, with a cloth bag of mugs she had taken home to wash. Mrs. Patel smiled at her. "You need not have done that." They were sitting by the sink. "That is where mugs are born to be." Fiona gave a faint smile and set them down. Across the hall, Nessie Curry leaned toward Jessie. "She looks worn." "Worn," Jessie agreed. Nessie lowered her voice. "Of course, strain will show on a person." Jessie nodded. "Especially if there is strain." Nessie looked pained. That was implied. Hamish took 2 mugs of tea and went toward Fiona. "Walk with me a minute," he said. Her face guarded itself at once. "Why?" "Because if I ask you questions here, the whole room will answer them by tomorrow." She glanced around. Several people discovered fascinating details in the floorboards. "All right." They stepped into the narrow corridor that led toward the store cupboard and the back door. The hall noises softened behind them. Chair legs, ladles, low voices trying not to be low voices. Hamish handed her the tea. "I need to know what you saw after supper." "I told you." "You told me part of it." She looked down at the mug. "I saw Duncan leave through the back. Later I saw him coming down by the side track. He looked angry." "Anything else?" "No." "Fiona," she said. "I saw Jamie go out too." Hamish went still. "After Felix?" "After Moira. Before Duncan." "Up the road?" "I don't know. He went out by the yard. He might have gone home." "Why did you not say?" "Because Blair would take that and beat him with it." Hamish could not argue with that. Fiona's fingers tightened around the mug. "Jamie is angry. Yes. But he is angry in the open. He burns hot, and then looks ashamed of the ashes. That is not the same as murder." "No," said Hamish. "It is not." Behind them, a floorboard creaked. Hamish turned. Jamie stood at the end of the corridor, half in shadow, his face hard. "So that's it?" he said. Fiona's eyes widened. "Jamie! You're telling him things about me?" "I'm trying to stop worse things being said. You think I need saving?" Hamish put down his mug on the windowsill. "Jamie, listen." "No. I heard enough." His eyes cut to Hamish. "You pretending you're on my side while asking everyone where I was. That is what police work sounds like when it is done gently." Jamie laughed once. "Gentle? Is that what you call it?" Fiona stepped toward him. "Please." He backed away. "Don't!" Then he turned and pushed through the door into the hall. The room went quiet far too fast. Jamie stood among them, breathing hard. "Hamish thinks I did it," he said. Hamish came after him. "That's not true. He's asking who saw me leave. He's asking Fiona. He's asking everyone." Nessie Curry's eyes widened with horror and appetite. Jessie put a hand to her mouth, slightly late. Moira looked stricken. Duncan Shaw folded his arms. Fiona came into the hall, pale now. "Jamie, I was only—" "You were only making sure I looked guilty before Blair did." That hurt her. The room saw it hurt her. And because people dislike witnessing pain they have helped create, several looked away as if Fiona had been indecent. Hamish felt the mistake settle in him. He had meant to protect her from Blair's rough hands, from being made into another village spectacle. Instead, he had taken her into a corridor and made secrecy visible. In Lochs, the appearance of concealment could do more harm than a plain accusation. "Jamie," he said quietly, "come outside with me." "No." Duncan spoke from the back. "Maybe the lad should answer questions in front of witnesses." Hamish turned his head. "And maybe grown men should no sound pleased when a boy is cornered." Duncan flushed. The door opened then, and Blair entered as if summoned by misfortune. He had a cigarette tucked behind one ear and a face bright with bad opportunity. "What's this?" No one answered. Blair looked from Jamie to Fiona to Hamish and smiled. "Well, well. Family drama without the family." Fiona's chin lifted. "Leave him alone." "That right?" Blair said. "You speaking for the boy now?" Hamish stepped between them. "Sir, This is not the time. It's exactly the time. I hear young Ross was seen leaving the hall after Harrow. Jamie stared at Fiona. She went white. The damage was done. I went out for air, Jamie said. Air up the hill? Blair asked. No. Then where? Nowhere. Blair laughed. That'll look grand in a statement. Hamish's voice became very soft. Sir, Blair ignored him. You threatened Harrow. You left the hall. Nobody saw you home. And now folk are whispering. Because you enjoy making them whisper, said Hamish. Blair swung on him. You watch yourself. No, you watch the boy. He's frightened, and frightened folk say stupid things. That doesna make them killers. Jamie's eyes flashed. I'm not frightened. Aye, said Hamish, without looking at him. That was one of the stupid things. A startled sound escaped Archie McLean. It might have been a laugh, quickly buried. Blair jabbed a finger toward Jamie. You'll come to Strathbane for questioning. On what grounds? Asked Hamish. On the grounds I say so. That's no grounds. That's weather. Mrs. Patel appeared from the kitchen. Inspector, if you remove him before supper, I will have an extra bowl and no patience. Blair's face darkened. This is a murder inquiry, not a church picnic. It is lentil soup, said Mrs. Patel. There is a difference. For a moment, the absurdity saved them. Not much, but enough for Jamie to breathe. Blair looked round the hall and seemed to calculate how much authority he could spend without looking foolish. He pointed at Jamie. Do not leave the village. Jamie said nothing. Blair turned to Hamish. And you, Macbeth? Stop playing nursemaid. You're not helping. The worst of it was that, this time, Hamish knew Blair was not entirely wrong. When Blair left, the room did not recover. People began speaking again, but softly, carefully, with their eyes sliding away from Fiona and Jamie. Moira took down the rota and put it back up crooked. Archie went to straighten it, then thought better of interfering with evidence of distress. Jamie walked out without looking at Fiona. She stood very still. Hamish approached her. I'm sorry, he said. She gave a small, tired shake of the head. You meant well, are ye? That's not always enough. No, said Hamish. It isna. She picked up the cloth bag and went into the kitchen. Outside, through the hall window, the repaired stretch of road was hidden by dusk. Somewhere beyond it lay the ditch, the broken peg cap, and Felix Harrow's last photographs. Inside, something else had broken. Not loudly, not beyond repair, but enough for everyone to feel the draught. Chapter 7. The Easy Villain. By the following morning, Lochdu had decided Jamie Ross was probably guilty, though most people were too decent to say so directly. Instead, they said things like, "It's a shame, with his mother working so hard," and "A temper like that leads nowhere good," and, of course, nobody is accusing anyone. Nobody, in village language, was often the busiest person in the room. Hamish heard it first outside Patel's shop, where the wind had dropped and people had no weather to blame for lingering. Nessie Curry stood by the vegetable crate, with Jessie at her side. "I only say," Nessie murmured, "that if a boy threatens a man in public, people are bound to remember it." "Bound," Jessie said. "And if he then disappears at the relevant time—" "Relevant," Jessie supplied. Nessie sighed. "I do wish you would stop echoing me like a damp church." Jamie Ross came out of the shop carrying milk and a packet of biscuits. The talk stopped so abruptly it might as well have been shouted. His face hardened. "Morning," said Hamish, who had been leaning by the window with Lugs at his feet. Jamie gave him one quick look. "Is it?" Lugs sniffed the biscuit packet with professional interest. "They're not for him," Jamie said. "He lives in hope. So does everyone. Doesn't make it clever." The boy walked off, shoulders stiff. Hamish watched him go. Across the street, Duncan Shaw was loading tools into the back of his van. He moved with calm purpose, nodding to people who passed, offering small remarks about the road reopening soon if everyone kept their heads. He looked exactly like the sort of man a village wanted in a crisis. Solid, practical, useful. That was what troubled Hamish. Useful men were often believed before true ones. Blair arrived before 10, stamping into the shop with cigarette smoke clinging to him, though he had put the cigarette out somewhere outside. He found Hamish near the tins of soup. "Macbeth." "Good. Saves me hunting you. A rare mercy." Blair ignored that. "We're bringing Ross in." "On what?" "Threat, opportunity, no alibi." "Thin." "I've had thicker soup than your theories." Mrs. Patel looked up from the counter. "That is because you have not tried my lentil." Blair scowled. "This is police business. This is also my shop." Hamish stepped outside with Blair before the conversation became a siege. On the pavement, Blair lit another cigarette and cupped it against the wind. "The boy threatened Harrow's camera," he said. "Harrow's camera was smashed. The lens cracked in the fall. You know that?" "No. Neither do you." Blair jabbed the cigarette toward him. "He left the hall. So did Moira. So did Duncan. Duncan went to check tarps. Jamie went for air. Convenient. Both are." Blair's eyes narrowed. "You've a soft spot for strays. Dogs, boys, sad women. It'll make a fool of you." Hamish's voice stayed mild. "Better that than making a fool of the law." Blair's face reddened. "Watch it!" A shout came from the end of the street. Jamie had stopped near the harbour wall. Duncan Shaw stood in front of him, one hand on the side of his van, speaking low. Whatever he said made Jamie's face flare. "You don't know anything," Jamie snapped. Duncan replied, "I know you should keep your mouth shut before you ruin your mother." That carried. Several heads turned. Jamie lunged a step forward. Duncan did not move. Blair smiled as if the scene had been arranged for him. "There," he said. "Look at that." Hamish was already walking. "Jamie," he called. The boy turned. "What? Going to tell me to calm down so everyone can say I look guilty calmly?" Duncan lifted both hands. "I was only giving advice." "Aye," said Hamish. "Advice often sounds better before it leaves the mouth." Duncan's jaw tightened. "The lad needs sense. And you're selling it by the yard?" Blair came up behind them. "Ross, you'll come with me." Jamie went pale beneath the anger. "Why?" "For questioning. I didn't do anything." "That'll be refreshing, then." Fiona Grant had appeared outside the shop, a loaf of bread held against her coat. She looked at Jamie, then at Hamish. The fear in her face was quiet and controlled, which made it worse. Hamish turned to Blair. "Before you haul him off, there's something you'll want to hear." Blair snorted. "From you?" "From the camera card." That stopped him. Macnab had telephoned Hamish an hour earlier from Strathbane, partly because he respected him, and partly because he enjoyed annoying Blair in ways difficult to prove. The damaged camera had yielded several late photographs. Most were blurred. Mist, yellow pegs, road edge, wet grit. But the timestamps mattered. "Harrow took a picture at 7:42, Hamish said, "at the damaged bend." "So?" At 7:44, Jamie was seen outside the hall yard by Mrs. Wellington, helping her with a crate of bowls. Jamie stared. "I was?" Mrs. Wellington, who had been approaching with the solemnity of a battleship, said, "You were. You carried them badly, but you carried them—" Blair rounded on her. "Why didn't you say—" "No one asked me. You were too busy shouting." A small sound went through the onlookers. It was not quite laughter. It was relief, trying on shoes. Blair's mouth worked. 2 minutes is time enough not to get from the hall yard to the upper bend in the mist, said Hamish. Not unless Jamie has wings and a fondness for dramatic timing. Jamie looked dazed. As if innocence had arrived late and in poor condition, Hamish continued. "And there's the grit." "What grit?" Blair demanded. "The wet grit at the ditch edge is mixed with red quarry dust from the upper pile. Jamie's boots yesterday had Black Harbour mud and kitchen ash on them. I checked them when he crushed that cigarette." "You checked my boots?" Jamie said. Aye, that's creepy. It's policing. The two are sometimes neighbours, Duncan said sharply. Plenty of folk had red grit on their boots. Exactly, said Hamish. Duncan realised too late that he had stepped where Hamish wanted him. Blair glared. So who are you accusing now? No one yet? Convenient again? No. Cautious. Hamish turned to Jamie. You did threaten Felix. That gave folk an easy story. Dinner helped them write another. Jamie swallowed, then nodded once. Fiona crossed the street and touched his sleeve. He did not pull away this time. The village stood around them, embarrassed by its own appetite. Nessie Curry looked at Jessie. Jessie looked at the ground. Mrs. Wellington adjusted her gloves with the severe air of a woman who had been right but would not spoil it by smiling. Blair threw down his cigarette and ground it under his heel. This proves nothing. No, said Hamish. It disproves something. That's often where truth starts. Blair stormed toward his car. Duncan Shaw shut the back of his van a little too hard. Hamish heard it. So did Lugs, who lifted his head, decided no biscuit was involved, and went back to sleep beside the shop door. For the first time since Felix Harrow had fallen, the village had lost its easiest villain. It did not look grateful. It looked exposed. Chapter 8. Sonsie brings plastic. That night Hamish's cottage behaved like a damp old beast determined to die by inches. The kitchen light flickered twice, gave one last sour glow, and went out. The heater coughed, clicked, and surrendered. Rain tapped at the window with the steady malice of a creditor. Hamish stood in the dark, holding a saucepan of soup Mrs. Patel had sent over for the dog, though there was far too much onion in it for that to be true. Well, he said. Lugs, already settled in the only dry chair, opened one eye and offered no assistance. You could at least look concerned. Lugs closed the eye again. Hamish found a candle in the drawer, along with 3 dead batteries, an old fishing hook, 2 buttons, and a council letter he had been meaning not to answer. He lit the candle and set it on the table. The flame made the small room warmer to look at, if not to sit in. His boots stood by the door, still marked with the red-brown grit from the hill road. Beside them lay the notes he had made after visiting the road again. Peg placement, ditch angle, wheelbarrow marks, boot impressions, camera timestamps. Facts were tidy things when written down. People were not. Jamie had not killed Felix Harrow. Hamish felt sure of that now. The boy had threatened in public, burned bright, and then stood in his own fear like a fool. There was no craft in him, no patience, no cold arrangement of peg and ditch and mist. Duncan Shaw had patience. He had usefulness too, which was better cover than innocence. A useful man could go anywhere. Check the tarps, move the gravel, shift a peg, carry a tool, be seen and not questioned, but suspicion was not proof. Hamish sat at the table and looked again at the copied camera timings MacNab had slipped him, with the muttered explanation that Blair was away shouting at another thing. Felix's last usable photographs were strange, blurred, and poorly framed. Yellow pegs in mist, the damaged verge. A close shot of gravel bags under tarpaulin. A delivery tag with half the number visible. Then nothing for 4 minutes. Then a final smear of light and dark, as if the camera had swung sharply. 4 minutes. Long enough for words. Long enough for fear. Long enough for someone to step too close or be made to. Outside. Something scraped at the door. Lugs lifted his head. The scrape came again. Hamish took the candle and opened the door. Sonsie slid in like a piece of the night that had decided the cottage belonged to him. The wildcat paused on the mat, rain beading his fur, eyes bright and offended by hospitality. In his mouth was something yellow. Lugs sat up, deeply insulted. Sonsie dropped the object on the floor, gave Hamish a look of bleak superiority, and sprang onto the windowsill. "Good evening to you, too," said Hamish. He crouched. The thing on the mat was a chewed piece of yellow plastic. Mud clung to one edge. It was curved, with a ragged, bite-shaped crack along the rim. Hamish did not touch it at first. He went to the shelf, took an envelope, and used it to turn the piece over. The candlelight caught the edge. It was the missing tooth from a survey peg cap, or near enough to make his heart give one quiet lift. Luggs sniffed it. "Leave," said Hamish. Luggs looked betrayed, and retreated to the chair. Hamish held the plastic near the candle. There were tiny scratches on it, not from teeth alone. A pressure mark. A dark smear along the inside curve. He thought of the cracked cap near the bend. The sliver found by Felix's hand. This new piece had not lain in the ditch. Sonsie would not have brought it from the taped-off road now, not with police and rain and men tramping over it all day. "Where did ye get this, you wicked wee thief?" Hamish murmured. Sonsie washed one paw with contempt. Hamish opened the door and looked out. The rain had eased. Beyond the cottage, the lane ran black and shining. Sonsie had come from the back, from the rough ground that led toward the sheds, the old byre, and the side path climbing toward Duncan Shaw's yard. Hamish set the plastic in the envelope and put on his coat. Luggs slid off the chair at once. "Now," said Hamish. Luggs looked at the soup saucepan. "Guard that." This responsibility satisfied him. Hamish took his torch and went out. The village was mostly dark. One light burned in Patel's shop upstairs. Another glowed at Fiona's cottage, pale behind thin curtains. The road beyond the village was hidden by cloud and black heather. He followed the side path, keeping to the grass where he could. Water sucked at his boots. The torch beam caught nettles, stone, fence wire, and the occasional gleam of sheep eyes that made the night seem to blink. Duncan Shaw's yard sat behind his cottage, half screened by a corrugated shed and a line of stacked pallets. By day it looked untidy, but honest. Tools, pipes, old tyres, bags of sand, a cement mixer with rust on its frame. By night, everything looked like it had been interrupted. Hamish did not go in. He stood by the wall and shone the torch low. There were tracks in the mud by the side gate. Wheelbarrow tracks, partly washed by rain, led from the yard toward the upper path. That alone meant little. Duncan used wheelbarrows, so did half the village badly. But against the wall, under a torn sheet of blue tarpaulin, lay 3 bags of gravel. They were not council bags. Not officially. Someone had cut away the delivery tags. Hamish crouched. A little red quarry dust had gathered where one bag had split at the seam. It was the same colour as the grit at the ditch edge. Again, not proof. Gravel travelled. Dust clung. Men borrowed. But the cut tags mattered. A dog barked somewhere below. Hamish switched off the torch and stood still. The back door of Duncan's cottage opened. Light spilled across the yard. Duncan stepped out in shirt-sleeves, holding a mug. For a moment he stood listening. He had the stillness of a man who expected trouble because he had earned some. Hamish remained by the wall, hidden in the dark beyond the shed. Duncan crossed to the tarpaulin and lifted one corner. He checked the bags beneath, then looked toward the path. "Not fear," thought Hamish. "Calculation." Duncan dropped the tarpaulin and went back inside. Hamish waited until the light went out. Then he returned by the lower path, slower than he had come. At the cottage, Luggs had abandoned guard duty and was asleep with his nose near the saucepan. Sonsie had vanished, leaving wet paw marks across the windowsill and the faint impression that civilization had disappointed him again. Hamish put the envelope on the table beside the camera timings. The cracked cap had broken during more than a fall. Pieces of it had travelled, one by Felix, one now from somewhere near Duncan's ground, carried in by a wildcat with criminal habits and excellent timing. A man could stage a misstep in fog. He could shift a peg. He could say he had gone to check tarps. He could even look useful while doing it. But he could not make every small thing loyal to his lie. Hamish sat in the candlelight until the soup cooled. Then he wrote one word under Duncan Shaw's name. Not murderer. Not yet. Gravel. Chapter 9. The Volunteer Debrief. The road reopening was called a safety debrief because Moira Campbell said the word celebration would be inappropriate. Naturally, everyone came. By 4 o'clock, the village hall was full of damp coats, restrained curiosity, and tea strong enough to float a nail. The repaired road was passable again, though nobody was quite ready to trust it. A fresh line of yellow-capped pegs marked the safer edge. The cracked one was gone, but Hamish could still see it in his mind. The little tooth missing from the rim, bright against black mud. Duncan Shaw stood near the notice board, clean-shirted and grave. He looked like a man prepared to accept thanks modestly. Moira fussed with cups. Fiona sat near Mrs. Patel, hands folded. Jamie leaned against the wall, trying not to look as if the whole room still hurt him. Lugs lay beneath the tea table, sprawled like an old hearthrug, waiting for civic responsibility to drop a biscuit. Blair arrived late and loudly. "What's this, Macbeth? A tea party?" "A safety debrief," said Hamish. Blair snorted. "Same thing with poorer biscuits." Mrs. Patel looked at him. "You have not yet been offered one." Hamish stepped to the front before Blair could reply. "I'll no keep you long," he said. "That'll be a first," muttered Blair. Hamish ignored him. Felix Harrow died on the damaged bend. At first it looked as if he'd gone too near the edge in mist and fallen. That was the easy answer. The room tightened. "Easy answers are comfortable things," Hamish went on. "They ask very little of us. This one let folk think Felix had been foolish, and later it let folk think Jamie Ross had been violent." Jamie stared at the floor, but Felix was not only photographing faces and washing lines. He was photographing delivery tags, gravel bags, peg placements, and the road itself. Duncan's expression did not change. That, in its way, was impressive. Hamish took an envelope from his pocket and removed a small yellow fragment sealed in a clear bag. The cracked peg cap near the ditch broke before the fall was finished being staged. One piece was found near Felix's hand. Another turned up later, carried by Sonsie to my cottage. A murmur moved through the hall. "Sonsie?" said Blair. "A more reliable witness than some," said Hamish. Lugs lifted his head at the name, decided no rival cat was present, and lowered it again. Hamish placed the bag on the table. "The pieces matter because the peg was shifted. Felix didn't simply stumble past it. Someone used the peg and the fog to guide him toward the unsafe edge. There was a confrontation. The cap cracked. Felix went down. Then the scene was made to look like foolishness." Blair barked. "And you can prove who did that, can you?" "Aye." Duncan gave a short laugh. "This is nonsense." Hamish turned to him. Felix had noticed the gravel quantities didn't match the road. More was delivered than appeared on the repair. He photographed tags because the tags told a story. Moira gasped softly. Duncan shook his head. "You're guessing." "I wondered at first. Then I saw cut tag gravel bags under the tarpaulin in your yard. That was leftover material." "Leftover from what?" Duncan's face hardened. Hamish continued, calm and soft. "From the council drop, diverted to your own drive and sold quietly as surplus to 2 crofts beyond the hill. A little local improvement, a little cash. Nothing grand enough to feel like theft, if a man speaks kindly to himself." "That's a lie. Felix was going to print the delivery tags with the road photos. He told you paperwork tells stories. He was vain, rude, and careless with shame, but he had seen the missing gravel." Duncan looked at Moira. "You kept the records." Moira's face went red. "I signed what you told me had arrived." "Aye," said Hamish. "Because Duncan was useful, and useful men are trusted." The words sat heavily. Hamish looked toward Blair. "The camera timestamps place Felix at the bend. Jamie was at the hall yard 2 minutes later, carrying bowls for Mrs. Wellington. Duncan had left by the back, supposedly to check tarps. Fiona saw him later coming down by the side track from his yard. His boots carried the same red quarry grit as the ditch edge. "Half the village had grit," Duncan snapped. "But not half the village had cut-tag bags in a private yard and a reason to stop Felix's photographs." For the first time, Duncan looked less angry than tired. He would have ruined me, he said. No one moved. He came sniffing about like we were exhibits. He didn't understand how things work here. A few bags of gravel. Public gravel, said Moira, voice shaking. Duncan turned on her. And who keeps your road passable when the council forgets you exist? Who brings tools? Who fixes walls for half price? Who comes out when drains choke and roofs slip? Hamish's voice cut in, quiet and cold. That may explain why folk trusted you. It does not explain why Felix died. Duncan's mouth trembled once, then tightened. He wouldn't listen, he said. He laughed. Said a good caption could finish a man quicker than a court. I grabbed the peg to show him the safe edge. He pulled away. The cap cracked. He slipped. And after? Duncan did not answer. Hamish did it for him. After, you let the fog finish the lie. Blair stepped forward at last, face dark with the annoyance of a man arriving late to the truth. Duncan Shaw, I'm arresting you. You'll let McNab do it properly, said Hamish. Blair glared, but McNab, who had appeared quietly near the door, moved in with professional calm. Duncan did not fight. That made it worse. As he was led out, the village watched him with the shocked betrayal reserved for people who have used one good quality to hide a worse one. No one looked at Jamie for a long time. Then Mrs. Wellington crossed the hall and said, Young man, you carried those bowls very badly. Jamie blinked. But you carried them, she added. It was an apology, in her language. Fiona rose and went to him. She did not touch him. She simply stood beside him where everyone could see. Hamish looked around the hall. Moira, pale with shame. Nessie and Jessie silent for once. Mrs. Patel pouring tea because some rituals were mercy, not avoidance. The road was mended. The village was not quite, but repairs, Hamish knew, often began with seeing where the ground had given way. Lochs got its road back. Cars passed again, slowly and cautiously, over the repaired stretch above the village. Yet something more delicate than gravel had shifted. People remembered how quickly they had reached for Jamie Ross, because he was angry, young, and easy to imagine guilty. They remembered, too, how loudly some spoke of community spirit, while quietly taking from the very community they praised. The cracked, yellow peg cap was meant to mark the safe edge. In the end, it marked something else. The place where pride, fear, and selfishness had met in the mist. Small safety markers do not only guide feet. Sometimes they expose hands. A village is not measured by how often it says, "We help." It is measured by who it protects when gossip is hungry. That night, soup appeared on Fiona Grant's step without a note. Lugs slept like a laird by Hamish's fire. Sonsie prowled the dark as if Lochs belonged to him, which he had always believed. And ordinary life returned, a little humbler than before. Have you ever seen a group blame the easy person just to stop feeling afraid? Thank you for walking the single-track road with us tonight. If this story kept you guessing, leave a quiet light in the window for the next visit to Lochs. And when the village settles for the easy villain, Hamish follows a cracked yellow cap to the truth.